Welcome to this second episode of our online seminar series called Revisiting 10 Key TANTlab Papers. I'm very pleased to see you. Some of you, I think, were at the first seminar and some of you were not. Both things are really great. These sessions are designed so that you can follow them individually, but also they're circling around similar issues, so we might draw connections back and forth. I should say that we are recording this session, and we will make it available later through our homepage and possibly also other platforms. My name is Torben Elgaard Jensen. I'm a professor of science and technology studies, and I'm the leader of the Techno-Anthropology lab. I'm also one of the hosts of this seminar. The two other hosts are Mathieu Jacomy.
Hello.
Who is an engineer, who is a developer of digital tools, who is my next door office neighbor, and an assistant professor in the Techno-Anthropology lab. The third host is Matt Artz, who is he's located in Baltimore, where he works as an AI product manager at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Matt is a great friend of the lab and an avid reader of our papers, and he's also a very active person in the American field of applied anthropology. Why are we doing this seminar series? Why are we revisiting these what we see as 10 key TANTlab papers one at a time? We do it basically because we think these papers raise interesting questions rather than settle them. In the Techno-Anthropology lab for more than a decade, we have been discussing how to combine digital and participatory methods. We have ideas, but basically the jury is still out. We've also been discussing how to follow and engage with the increasing digitalization and digital mediation of our societies. Again, we have projects, we have ideas, but we have no final answers to these questions. And in a broader sense, the Techno-Anthropology lab has been a location for discussions about the roles we want to play as engaged scholars, and about the kinds of stories we want to tell about life in the digital Anthropocene. These are discussions that we would really like to have, that we enjoy to have, and that we will want to keep going. And that's sort of a key purpose of these seminars. The papers we have selected offer different inroads to these important discussions, but the papers are, of course, only one resource. More importantly, we have the authors of the papers with us. With them, we really hope to bring out the interesting issues and also to bring them up to date. Accordingly, we begin each of the seminars with an author interview. Matt will interview one of the authors of today's paper, in this case, Koed, to tease out how he thinks about the issue raised in the paper, and how this issue may perhaps have moved or look differently today. After the interview session, we invite all of you to join the discussion. Before handing over to Matt and Anders, let me just briefly introduce today's paper. The paper is from 2019. It was published in Big Data and Society and is called Experiments with the Data Public: Moving Digital Methods into Critical Proximity with Political Practice. The authors are, in addition to Anders Koed Madsen, Anders Kristian Munk. This paper says...
I just got an SMS. Anders, you are in TANTlab, right?
I thought these seminars were physical. I'm in the TANTlab.
Great, Anders, fantastic. So yes, the organizers are just hiding in our offices not to get distracted by the crowds, but they're great to see you on location. Yes, so this paper tells the story of how Anders and Anders were involved in facilitating a kind of democratic experiment in the municipality of Aalborg. At that time, there were wide-ranging debates about the local implementation of a new national school reform. The municipality tried to orchestrate a broad debate in Aalborg, in part by encouraging a broad group of stakeholders to engage in public debate on the municipality's Facebook page. Anders were then involved in articulating what this datafied public was doing and in producing data analyses and visualizations that could be fed back into the debate. The story of what then happened is instructive. We will return to that later. A particularly strong feature of the article that I will mention before handing over to Matt and Anders is that the article very carefully unpacks a series of ideas about what a public might be, and those are ideas that live among actors in the field. They're native ideas, so to speak. So we hear about the public as collectively caring for a school, for instance, the public as participants in debates, the public as a broad resource for ideas, and also the public as collectively intelligent in some kind of way. So there are lots of interesting, fascinating stuff to talk about here. And again, warm welcome to everybody. And without further ado, I will hand over to Matt and to Anders.
Sure. Sorry for the little charger snafu there. So jumping right in, I'm coming from the States. I see Mathieu Hill on as well. He's also from the New York area. We may have folks who watch this, in the future once it's shared out. So could you help us just sort of set the stage, and for anybody else even, who was on that, maybe wasn't dialed in at the time, just help set the stage. Tell us a little bit about, the context of what was happening at that time in Denmark and, how this project came to be.
Yeah, Anders, should I have a go at it first, and then you can supplement? So I think what happened in Denmark at that point in time was that there was a massive reform of the schooling system in Denmark, initiated by the state. So there was part of that reform was changing the way the teachers were supposed to work, but also changing the hours of the schooling to be longer in the day, which had repercussions for instance, the leisure activities of the pupils. Could they make it to their football training in time, and so on? So there was a reform of the structure of the school, and with that reform also of what was being taught, also initiatives to teach things differently. So a lot of things was thrown up in the air. It sparked a big controversy amongst the teachers and the state. The teachers felt that they had this reform stuffed down their throats, and it actually ended in a lockout, like a quite massive conflict where the schools were closed for some times. And after the state made this mess, they put it to the municipalities to kind of reorganize and regain trust in the schooling system from these different stakeholders in the school, and that was that's the context of where we were brought in to this. It's important to say that we were hired in as consultants, which is sort of different from the other projects we have done. So there was the school, the municipality of Elgaard had this call for tender, or this procurement, stating that they wanted to reinvent the way they did engagement around public policy issues, in this case the school, and it was specifically called for that they would like ideas of how to use Facebook and social media to involve the public in this discussion about the school. So it was a quite strict process where some things were specified, and so the whole thing was about inventing ways of making the public visible to the policymakers, who would then in the end make decisions about the budgeting for the next 3 years of the school. So that would be, should more money be used on cross-school sharing of best practices after the new reform, or should money be spent on fixing the toilets or whatever, right? So there was a clear budgeting prioritization in the end. So that was the political context. Our context was that we had been working with digital methods for some time, and we were inspired by pragmatist ideas of the public. And in the field of digital methods, there was a set of things that we said to each other. So, for instance, that it's good to not, play along with the usual metrics of the social media platforms. We should reinvent the way we measure stuff through these platforms. which is something that we later on discussed in the paper that had impacts on, for instance, the visibility of established actors like the teachers union. But our motivation, and maybe you can add now, Anders, our motivation was that we would like to put some of these methodological prescriptions that we told each other at conferences to a practical test in a quite contentious political situation. So that was our motivation for entering this project. Anders, I don't know if you have any things to add to this.
Not much, perhaps, except two things: that it was a period where Facebook was viewed upon very differently than today. So I think it's 11 years ago now, and it was only a couple of years after Facebook pages had become available and the municipalities were widely starting to use these platforms. And the general discourse on that was, well, that's where the citizens are. They don't show up at the meetings, so we have to go there to engage them. And maybe the other thing is that one of those things we frequently told each other at conferences was that multiplicity is good, right? So that the point of digital methods should be to show multiplicity, which is one of the things we then informed our repurposing.
Yeah, and it was this story was also something that they had experienced themselves, that people were showing less and less up to the citizen hall meetings and voicing their expressions elsewhere. So the public was sort of not in where it was supposed to be. So this was a call for them tracing that public.
Great. Thank you both for that. So a few things in there that I'd like to kind of unpack for everybody. And I'll kind of start from the top, but so the consulting engagement. So, last time we in our last session, obviously we spoke of, some of the history of the lab with, with data sprints, with sort of, controversy mapping, broader. But as you alluded to, much of that was done as projects in the lab where I'll just say you're partnering with others. This time around, there's compensation involved. And you spoke about the big political situation that was happening with the school reform, but what about the politics involved in the working relationship? Any lessons learned there about how you were engaging?
I can maybe have a go again, and then you can follow up. But I think one thing that is quite different when you're hired in as a consultant in a set procurement is that there's not the same room to fail as there is in some of the other projects we did with the Royal Danish Theatre. Were more like playful projects where we convened together to try things out, and those things might turn out completely, like complete failure, so we would leave them aside. Whereas this was supposed to lead to a budgeting, prioritization, and there was these meetings that were scheduled, and some of these meetings included almost 2,000 people convening to look at the digital maps we had produced. So there was a sense in like it was a train that had to move forward, and there was also somebody paying for that train ticket who had specific ideas about where it would go. So I think it was, to me, it was a different way of working than some of the other things we had done. What are your thoughts on us on this?
Yes, I remember we had the deal we had was that we could publish on this. So we were free to use this as empirical material, and that we would be responsible for the analysis of these things. But of course, we could not organize the process. We were not driving that train. And so, as I remember it, we had quite a lot of autonomy in terms of what kind of analysis we wanted to do. But of course, deciding exactly what to show and what not to show also prompted conversations with the municipality that became empirical material. But what was really different here was that we did not decide the overall nature of the process and who was going to get invited and involved and why and when and so forth.
But I think one of the things that was really appealing with this was that there was also this big machinery around the project that would actually mean that, you know, we got into situations, policy making situations that we would never have gotten into had we not jumped that train. And then I think, as you say, Anders, that some of the organization of the whole process was out of our hands, but the analytical part was sort of our responsibility. And one of the red lines we drew at one point was this, I don't know if you've all read the paper, but there's this moment where, you know, we start visualizing what the debates are, and then suddenly there's a big theme that is just super critical of the municipality, you know, critical to the extent that it's compared to Nazi Germany and so on. But at that point, we had sort of decided what the sort of protocol was for making these visualizations. So at that moment, I thought it was we had kind of the power to say these things stay in, because if we begin to delete some voices, then you know, we're not following protocol. So I don't know if you remember it the same one as it's 10 years ago, but I remember that the first reaction from the municipality was just to erase those super critical voices under the argument that this is not proper democratic Habermasian dialogue or something along those lines. Do you remember it better, Anders, that situation?
No, that's also how I remember it. And then I think what the compromise was that we then had to go on videos and like explain the process and why we chose to do it the way we did it and so forth.
So jumping in there, so the alderman was driving much of the process to a degree, right? Setting vision, so forth. But you were involved in a lot of still the methodological choices with the digital traces. So, you know, you write about the need to actively, you know, sort of render the data public visible. And you were just touching on some of the methodological choices you made. And so would you mind kind of getting into that a bit? Why did you make the choices that you made? You know, what did you leave out? You know, any lessons learned from that?
Yeah, I think there was this. So that's what we're trying to describe with this affordance space concept in the paper, which I don't know if it's the right way to describe it. But the thing is that when you work with digital data, you don't have the same established constants as you would in other. Like if you do a survey, you know sort of like the public you sample from is a specific you know, constant, and you sample out, you can sample multiple times and so on. But we had to invent all these constants, or what we call invariants, along the way. So we had to invent like the post is the constant space that we take data from. The mathematical space of Giphy is the constant space we measure change towards, and so all these we had to make all these choices. And then there was this sort of scene in the backlight, looking backwards, there was this sort of unholy alliance between us and the alderman about, you know, visualizing multiplicity, because one of the choices we made was that the amount of likes on something is not going to have a huge impact on its visibility in the visualization. So that meant that, for instance, a professional political actor like the teachers union that mobilize a lot of likes and in the normal Facebook system would get a lot of visibility through that in the feed algorithm, would suddenly, you know, just be one theme amongst many in the visualization. So this choice of bypassing the metrics from the medium and inventing our own to show multiple voices was sort of one of the decisions we made together with the alderman and the director that would probably have looked different if the teachers union had been part of the room where the operationalization of the public was negotiated. Yeah, Anders, I don't know if you want to follow up on that.
Well, so there were two stages to this, right? So we were both involved in a sort of, all of this culminated at this one workshop day where 1,600 school stakeholders were sitting in a big sports arena in Aalborg and writing visions for the school. And this is what became the eventual datascape that came out of this. And so these choices that Anders was just talking about was in the sort of the open Facebook debate that led up to that day. And so all of this was done to prompt further discussion. So it was not, those choices were made because the idea was not at that point to settle what were important enough to be carried forward in the political process, but what were the multiplicity of positions that were out there. Because at that moment, from our perspective, the important thing was to, like, the point of making the public visible was to show the different ways in which the school reform was being discussed, to try to prompt further conversation of them at the workshop day. So we were not in the mode yet of saying these are the important topics and these are not, which is why we did not repurpose the like, if you will.
And maybe also to add to that, the Facebook page in these months was not a usual Facebook page, but because part of the whole process was also that this consultancy that was the main consultancy doing the whole process had all these meetings with the pupils in the schools, and so they went out physically to each school and had these meetings, stakeholder involvement meetings, where these meetings would end up with people writing on the Facebook page. So it's not a normal the Facebook page also just turned into sort of like a shared forum that people were forced into in a sense in this procedure. So that also means that some of the stuff that is there is not organically would not have been on Facebook if it wasn't for this process of forcing it into Facebook. But the reason why the alderman liked it was that, or especially the director, who's now director of Aarhus municipality, he really liked this idea that people would see each other's inputs, what we call the public, that these would not be negotiations or discussions on local intranets of local schools, but everything was kind of merged into a virtual soapbox where you had to voice your opinion in order to get heard. So there was this also in the interviews we did with him, was this underlying normative assumption that if you don't dare step up on that soapbox, your opinion will not be heard. A private opinion is not a legit opinion, which is almost the opposite in a survey, right? You're usually interviewed in private, you're anonymous, and this is the logic behind the survey, and has been for 100 years, that it's the private opinion that is driving it, and then they're aggregated later on. So it's just to say that the Facebook page was not a normal Facebook page, and it might maybe also have been strange to then imply the normal metrics on that page, because it was sort of used differently.
So speaking of the concept of the page and relating it back to, your affordance space idea. So, you do mention like the Facebook API is essentially as a constraint ultimately, right? And so how has your thinking changed on the concept of affordances within a digital context, and how like platforms ultimately shape what we have access to, or even shape behavior, closed rooms, versus closed groups versus open groups, etc. Any thoughts on that, and how your thinking has matured?
Maybe, unless you can have a go on this, but just one thought is that the middle part of that affordance space visualization would be probably much more detailed now, where the Facebook API was way more open back then and allowed way more flexibility than it would do now, what allows almost nothing. But Anders, do you want to have a go at this first, or?
Well, I think actually what was interesting about that process were the things that Anders described before, that there was quite a lot of counteraction to the Facebook affordance space going on, right? So the municipality had quite a lot of ideas about, it was not like they just took the Facebook page and went, this is going to be great public engagement. Like the reason why we were a small cog in a much larger process was that they had very strong ideas about what would be good public engagement to achieve their goals. For that, they needed to repurpose the page itself, right? So they worked against that by organizing, flash mobs that would go on Facebook and get opinions. Like they tried to change the discourse on that page, basically. And then they got us in to try and repurpose the metrics that would be otherwise available. So, and it's true what Anna says that we had much more flexibility back then because the API allowed for more experimentation with how you could do things. But I actually think that it was a pretty good example of how maybe to try to generalize it. Like I'm not a big fan of the sort of tech determinist accounts of how Facebook prescribes the way we behave, and I think that there's, in a Danish context, there's been other interesting work showing how citizen groups have actually repurposed Facebook groups to be as quite a powerful community instrument. And so whereas we know much more today about Facebook's intentions in designing their algorithmic environment and their business model in relation to that, which we can only intimate then, I think. I actually think having such a case from back then should also at least cause you to stop and think, well, so how, even though that is Facebook's intentions and that's the affordances of their algorithms and so forth, how much does it actually determine in terms of social reality around something like a Facebook page? Or maybe another story about it would be that it took that huge machinery and all that effort to just work a little bit against it.
Also, I mean, I think it's also curious that we don't discuss at all, the impact of the feed algorithms or, in this affordance space, which might be more prevalent now that, some people might just not see the Facebook page of Aalborg Municipality in their feed and thus not be invited to this virtual soapbox that you apparently had to stand on in order to have a legit opinion about the school at that point. So I think we know we will probably discuss that affordance space quite differently now. And I think, of course, also looking back at the choice to have the municipality Facebook page and the post field as the constant, data collection entity throughout the process is, of course, also a choice that brings the public back home to the municipality. Whereas in the beginning, we had all these ideas about, cross-media analysis and trying to follow the stakeholders where they were actually themselves energized in discussing this, but there was this strong idea of having one place where the public could see each other and see each other's opinions, and that's, of course, when you have that normative ideal, usually that place is a place that is owned by municipality or a citizen hall or something along those lines. Whereas, for instance, now when I do work on digital cities, I would never think that the interesting voices to listen to would make themselves visible on the local municipalities Facebook groups. There are a lot of they're elsewhere again.
But I mean, I guess that it's also that Facebook has just changed, right? So it's not just that our thinking around it has changed, but it has also changed. So I recently ran into the director at another event. We were both slated to talk at the Danish Data Ethics Council in one of their meetings. The two of us, uncoordinated, not about this project, we were invited to talk about data sovereignty. And we met each other there. None of us knew that the other one was going to be there. And we just laughed that it would be fun to start a talk in 2025 and data sovereignty, just recalling this project. And he jokingly said, like, you know, we should probably never talk about that Elgaard project again, right? Because of course today, if a municipality went out and said, like, we're just gonna, you know, convene our completely critical public engagement process on an American tech platform, that would be suicide, right? But that was just really not the feeling in 2014. It was, you know, it had already been decided before they came to us that, hey, you know, this is where the public is. There was also not a lot of, there was insane Facebook penetration, right? Everyone was on there, not everyone, of course, but compared it to other platforms, it was the very obvious choice if you wanted to be the place where most people were.
So, you know, obviously you're expressing a number of reflections there that seem to imply that not only has the landscape shifted, but your thinking has shifted. Maybe you would do it differently today, even if at the time, right, it was sort of methodologically successful. But I guess is sort of with that as framing and zooming out, how might you, how do you think about engaging with the democratic process in this way, using these kinds of methods? You know, what might you do differently today if the same project came up?
I mean, looking back at the specific project, I think the latter part of the paper is listing some of what we call the recalcitrant effects of our choices. One of them being that the choice to just see patterns from below also meant that, you know, teachers were everywhere in this thematic space. Some teachers were interested in school playgrounds, other teachers were interested in the national legislation, which of course that visualization is super problematic if you want to have an organization that is the teachers union that speaks for a homogeneous group of teachers with a shared interest. So I think definitely like those with whom we negotiated how to do this was the alderman and the director of the municipality. So I think bringing more people into that process would probably have been a good idea, because I mean, you could probably say from the outset, you know, the 5 big democratic players who would have an interest in this, and the teachers union would be one of them, right? So just going and talking to them might have been useful. But I still believe in the underlying idea of, I mean, I just did my inaugural lecture under the heading "Stray Data, Stray Publics." So I still believe in the fundamental idea that the public will organize itself in various ways, or publics will organize themselves in various ways on available media channels. They've always done so. Back from, you know, the invention of print and so on, they've used that to convene themselves around certain ways of expressing themselves. And I still think that it's important to develop methods to trace that instead of assuming that you can convene one space for the public. So there's something in the underlying idea that I still subscribe to, but I would probably I would take more inputs from more stakeholders. I would probably also, I mean, one of the things we did was also just not to think about the usual, like, who are the powerful players in the representative democracy around the school. I mean, yeah, we didn't really take that very much into account. We just came with our idea of what a good pragmatist public would look like, and then we negotiated that with the municipality. I don't know if that's your story, Anders, but
well, I think if you had to do it again, I think presuming that you are hired by an actor and that it's not because, you know, we could always say, well, what if we did it again, but we were in charge of the process? Then sure, you can do something like, let's make maps that are from the point of view of other actors than the municipality. But that was not the that was not the reality here. And so I think there is like a discussion, and maybe this would be a topic for another TANTlab seminar, but this sort of intervention by invitation discussion, like you are invited in by an actor that has an interest, a stake here. So to a certain level, you have to accept that's the premise, right? And so if we did that today, I think what would change would be that the municipality would probably have other ideas about what would be a good platform. What I think what would probably not change is that the reason why you do something like this is because the established procedures for who gets to have a say and who decides these things, such as the teachers' union, have broken down. That's the fundamental premise of a controversy. It's a hot situation in Michel Calon's terms, right? So the whole point here is that there's no such thing as relying on, oh, let's just ask the teachers' union and then we will figure it out between us. That was blown up, that was gone, right? So that is when the doing in public steps in my estimation. I still believe in that part. And I think what I have used since mostly is the part where, well, when the doing public then steps in, there's a lot of skin process involved, right? That you can invite all these people into a room and let's all, throw up ideas and post-its on a wall, but then we leave and it's all forgotten. And I think what was the actual successful part of that project was building the datascape that then became part of the negotiation for prioritizing the school budget. So the interesting part is where the committee that decides the budget has to make decisions pointing back through the datascape to the discussions that took place on that day in that sports hall. So bootstrapping that process, I think, was really interesting, and that's something we've continued to work with. That would be stable.
Yeah. So that's actually the paper that we never got to write. That's a bit of a shame if that was the that was the big one. But there was this because we don't really unpack that in this paper. But this, you just see the visualization of the themes brought up. But that visualization was made interactive so that you could click on the theme and you could read the stories behind the themes. And that datascape was, as Anna said, in the final budget negotiations, every politician had that datascape in front of them. So there was an attempt to try to make the public sticky, whereas, as Anna said, one of the interviews with the alderman, she said that typically in engagement processes, you put the post-its on the wall and then you leave, you close the door, and then you walk away from the public again. You do what you wanted to do anyway. But so it was this attempt of trying to make this data public always, be there as a stone in the shoe of the politicians, had an interesting effect, because we have videos of that final negotiation where some people are just insistent, they just want more money to brain psychology and so on amongst kids, but nobody in the public debate had brought that up as a meaningful avenue for the budgeting. So they were sort of like this datascape became sort of like the obligatory passage point for, like, if you want something on the budget, you should be able to defend it in one way or another, with reference to this public that we had inscribed. And in some cases that was an interesting experiment, because as Anna said, it made it impossible to flee the public, but it also maybe sometimes made that datascape instead of stories a constraint on imagining. You could not get new ideas at those budget meetings because they had decided that the process was such that you would have to defend yourself with reference to the public debate.
Good. Appreciate that. So for the sake of time, I think we should open it up to others to jump in with questions. But I appreciate you sort of helping us see the thought process about some of this, and particularly how you might even do things a little bit different, and sort of, the honesty about the situation and the complexity and challenges you faced when working in this context. I think it helps all of us, who are trying to do this work. And so I appreciate that. Anybody else want to jump in? Feel free to, I guess, just, we got some hands up.
I will start. My question is about ultimately how you see from today the attempt of operationalizing STS and making the multiplicity visible. I say that because the paper comments on the kind of unintended effects of this intervention that stems from this idea of making the multiplicity visible through Facebook data and network visualization. But to produce an expected effects, you don't have to be too serious at this. It can just be, an attempt, right? And then let's see what's going on, and then things happen. In a way, I find this idea of operationalizing the multiplicity a little bit naive, and I'm saying that also highlighting that it didn't just come from you. It was also the idea behind some of those actors about making the public visible through Facebook and so on. But now that we are much later, should we, would you still try to have a serious stab at operationalizing STS, or is it something that is not, we should not be really too serious about?
I think from my perspective, I'm still intrigued about the idea of operationalizing something also as a way of thinking it through. So just the process of having to operationalize what the public would look like from these traces opens discussions about what do we mean when we talk about a public. So, for instance, one of the things that was a big operationalization issue in this project was how to weigh different voices. So, somebody would speak a lot, others would speak less. Would that have an impact on their visibility? Which was then, the way that was dealt with was with comparing it to, a classic physical focus group where, what do you do as a moderator when somebody is just talking a lot? You try to silence them a little bit, but they might also have something to say. And so I think this task of operationalization is still interesting, also just for the process of it, because the process of making something operationalized is also a process of thinking through something that might otherwise be very not so. It's a way of thinking through concepts in a specific way that I still think is valuable. But I think if I was to operationalize this thing again, I think one of the things that we didn't do was to strike a balance between making the fringe voices visible, and then also respecting that a democracy also has a set of institutionalized players that are probably there for a reason. And for instance, the decision to just not take amount of likes or so on into account in the operationalization is also to really neglect that, a lot of political action has gone into mobilizing visibility through those likes, for instance, from the unions and so on. And I think some sort of balance between showing a variety of voices, but then also maybe having more respect for, more focus towards the established system, I think would be needed. Anders, I don't know what your thoughts are here.
Well, I actually remember the story a little differently. So, in the second phase, what ends up becoming the map that the politicians have to look at when they prioritize the budget, none of that comes from the public debate. That comes only from what was produced during that one day in the sports arena with 1,600 invited guests. And those guests were invited not from the general public, but from a curated set of groups that were considered to be important to the school. So it was mainly school teachers, it was parents, it was, you know, people running sports clubs in, you know, associated with the school, those kind of stakeholders. So I think there was a curation of who got to speak eventually. But otherwise, I agree very much with Anders that it is, and maybe that's a cynical sort of scientific stance, that it's interesting, and if only for the trying to operationalize this is not actually to try and make the world a better or more STS-y place. It's just because it helps you think about STS concept to be forced to try to operationalize them. And so that the heuristics of that is interesting. And for me, it spoke to a discussion we had some years earlier in this special issue of intervention, where, for example, I had a paper in there where I discussed the difference between John Lowen and Marie Motz, what I call the ontological guerrilla of them. Like, so there was a certain period where their papers were arguing that, well, multiplicity is always good if you challenge the hegemonic voices, then that's, you know, that's good in itself. And then against that, you had someone like Latour saying, well, we need to respect certain modes of existence more than others. We need to at least make them sing in their own tune. And I think the naivety of what we did with the let's just show the multiplicity kind of was an interesting take on that STS debate, because it became quite evident that it's very uncomfortable to challenge the hegemonic voices when the hegemonic voices is something like the teachers union, which for some reason everyone in STS or in our academic environment considers to be self-evidently good, or shouldn't apparently not be challenged in the same way as other kinds of power, right? So I think it shone an interesting light on that sort of, let's always challenge power. Yes, but what if power is the fucking teachers union? You know, that's still a good question.
Torben?
You're muted.
It's a super fascinating discussion, and I was really intrigued by Anders Munk's last comment here, because I've been trying to get my head around, you know, what is it? What can STS digital methods offer something to democracy, and if then what is that, or what's the strategy here? And when I read the paper, and when I saw also reading your conclusion, which was sort of quite, in a sense, apologetic towards what, you know, how you undermine the teachers union's voice and so on, I thought that, you know, the conclusion you would draw is that, okay, this is an attempt to make sort of a big mapping exercise that somehow went wrong, in a sense. But now it seems like perhaps to tease you a little bit, Anders, you're drawing the opposite conclusion here, that we need to sort of not just poke little criticisms at various parties, but we need to retain sort of the ambition of making a big map where we sort of cover all sorts of modes of existence. Or I'm not sure here. I mean, what is really the lesson here? Because I think another way to phrase this question is to say you could think of democracy as just sort of a series of failed attempts to formulate something. People irritate each other, like you trace something that is a stone in the shoe, and then the debate goes on and so on, but no one sort of stands up and says, here's the whole thing. But you could also say it as it is a sort of a process of constructing a big map. So this is becoming an increasingly badly formed question, but I don't know if you would like to sort of comment on perhaps the difference between tracing and being a stone in the shoe versus the ambition of still retaining the ambition of having a big map of the controversy or all the voices. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Should I go first, Jonas? Good question. I think I vividly recall our discussions also during the project as being that the multiplicity will be the stone in the shoe. We knew that. We aimed for that. That was the point. So in a sense, excusing that, or is a little bit hollow. I think I'm a radical believer in plurality, and that's the sense that I do believe in the big map showing the diversity of positions or modes of existence. And when I say believe in, I believe in it as a democratic good. That's just a normative position that I take. I think it helps democracy to hardwire that. On the other hand, I think this experiment, as many other experiments in this lab, shows that there is no such thing as one big map that does that without being more on someone's side than on others, right? That this map could have been made in many ways, and it was some of those operationalizations would have been more in the interests of some actors than others. So I think it simultaneously speaks to the inevitable complicity you have as a map maker. But there's no such thing as going in there and saying we're going to make a neutral, we're going to do that in a neutral way or from nowhere or whatever. This is so clearly from somewhere. And I think it shows and I hope that what we can learn from that experience is that there is just no way of making that. I mean, you could have made other choices, but they would also have been from somewhere, right? So that's the uneasiness of these kinds of interventions, is that you are inevitably complicit on someone's side. And I don't know how to compare those two things. I believe in both.
I would definitely echo that, and then I think for me the interesting thing actually goes back to this attempt of operationalizing, which is once you operationalize, you have a different. You get that if we hadn't operationalized these voices in a datascape that could position them next to each other and you could click them and go back, then they wouldn't have been able to travel into that's like a classic Latour point, right? They become more capable of traveling through the different processes because and I still think that is a very interesting prospect also with recent discussions about synthetic agents and so on representing certain voices in democracy. Like, to what extent is it possible to operationalize different perspectives with these methods, also in ways that these people carrying those perspectives agree with themselves or help train or help operationalize? And so that's still for me something that I think can be a democratic good. So I still believe in this operationalization, but I think in different ways. Time is running, so I'll let Anders and Mathieu have the
jump in.
Yeah. Mathieu.
Anders, I think you're ahead of me, Anders.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, Anders, please ask the question.
I'll try to be brief. Thank you all for this lovely meeting. I was just thinking, I'm curious about not just the distinction between issue publics and data publics, but also how it differ in how you operationalize your approach. Because what I'm hearing is that data publics is more about how you curate your public. So there's a stronger curation taking place, and there's a stronger way of operationalizing the specific voices. And then my question, I guess, is this difference between the issue public and the data public, are we with data public is that an effort to try to make one public, or are we still talking about publics? Because it feels like by curating your publics into a data public, it feels like you try to make it into one public as your visualization, for example, is an example of.
I can go first quickly. I don't think to me it's not an attempt to reduce it to a singularity or singular public. In my mind, I mean, they're obviously very related, but in my mind, issue publics have probably been around forever, right? People have formed groups around the things that matter to them. There was also the Dewey-Lippmann debate and so on. Those publics were not datafied in the same sense as they are now, because they take place elsewhere. They take place on digital media where they become data. But I think also what we try to make the argument for in the paper is that, you know, the data public is also something that is then curated in all these choices about how. So there's a lot of data traces out there. The public meets each other as data traces, but then to kind of summarize that in some sort of overview is an attempt to craft a data public or several data publics. In our case, it was probably one representation of different publics, but that would be my like conceptual distinctions, that the issue public is a more generic term, I think. What do you say, Anders?
I think in the interest of time, we will
I
just
agree.
sort of to the last questioner, Mathieu, and then try to have sort of if you can ask your question fairly briefly and have a brief response to that, and then we need to finish up. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So I was just wondering if people's positions in these different groups shifted as a result of the conversation, either of the map or in the context of the sports hall. Did people develop empathy for others' positions as a result of the map and the meeting in the sports hall? So that was my question. Thanks.
I think the answer is no. I think what or the answer is that we didn't really have a focus on that. We had I think our focus was on the extent to which this visualization of the public could do something to the policy process, and that, you know, but we tried to constantly feed the results back to the stakeholders through videos and so on, to make them aware of each other's stances on this issue, but we never made a serious attempt to track whether, you know, the ability to see that, oh, other people are having different issues than myself, if that changed people's. We didn't really study that. Anders, I don't know what if you have.
There was one anecdotal situation after the sports hall. I can't remember if it's in the paper, but there's this smaller workshop with the committee, the budget committee, where they have to go through the 7 clusters of the debate from the sports hall. And there's this one guy who keeps insisting that some something techniques, like the brain is very important in teaching. Like we need to focus on the neurological teaching, whatever techniques. And then you can see that we had that on video. That's video material for us that we work with afterwards. You can see how the others then use the datascape to check him on that, to say, okay, can you just show me where that is? Like, where do you find that in the concerns of the people who were there on that day? And he gets very frustrated with that, right? So it's not a particularly pleasant experience, but it does show how having the data public or wherever available there allows the others to check him a bit on his rather narrow perspective on learning.
But I read that more as they use the data public to kind of strengthen their own position against this, you know, spending money on brain science or psychologists. So I don't know if it's empathizing. It's more like it becomes a vehicle for position. Yeah, becomes a weapon.
All right, we are in the final minute of this session. Thank you so much. A special thanks to you, Anders and Anders, for taking us through this quite fascinating journey of your old project, and also I think it's an incredibly sort of honest paper that you've written about the difficulties, the tensions and the dilemmas, and you unpacked it further for us today and took us through these sort of still ongoing questions about how do we relate to public and democratic processes, how can we engage with these issue formation processes, what can we map, what can we trace, how can we position ourselves, and how can we also respect the some of the established stakeholders in the game, while still making room for fringe new actors and emerging coalitions. So this was super fascinating. Thank you so much for participating, everybody. The next time we will talk about a topic called critical proximity. It's probably the oldest of the papers that we have in the series, and the good thing about reading it now for next time, for October 1st, is that we already have a couple of great cases of critical proximity, namely the stuff we've been discussing this time, but also the participatory data design that we talked about last time. So I hope to see a lot of you next Wednesday. Thank you very much and have a great day.